She had just turned 24 years old. Her whole life was ahead of her. Then she was shot and killed. I'm Elizabeth Millner with Law&Crime. Now, we see these cases just far too often. One person is done with a relationship, then their partner refuses to let them go and does the unthinkable. And that's what appears to have happened in this case. Britnee Wicker, to her loved ones, was known for her infectious smile, sense of humor. She loved her friends and family. That was according to her GoFundMe page. But let's take you back to November 12th of 2023. This was about a week after Britnee turned 24, and suddenly she was dead. Her mom discovered her body in her home in Wichita, Kansas. It's just horrible to think about. According to a report by KAKE, her mom drove over to Britney's house to see if she was okay after not hearing from her over the weekend. She described to the outlet seeing her daughter's feet hanging off the bed. She initially thought she was just sleeping, but the discovery next is a mom's worst nightmare. She saw Britney had been shot in the head. So that leads to the next question. Who and why? According to the Wichita Police Department, their investigators were pursuing leads to arrest a suspect, and that suspect was Carlos Anderson-Honeycutt. About a week before Britney's death, she actually broke up with Carlos. Britney's mom told KAKE she previously had concerns about him, but never thought he would allegedly kill her daughter. Britney even confided in her mom about the fights they used to allegedly have, but both likely never imagined it would end like this. Carlos and Britney reportedly lived together, but just before her murder, like I said, they broke up. But another clue that kind of points to Carlos' state of mind was he was planning to unalive himself. Just a day before the shooting, Carlos was actually released from the hospital after undergoing a psychiatric evaluation. He was having issues with Britney, and the mother of his daughter reportedly planned to move their daughter out of state. It's unclear what led up to the shooting, meaning the time between Carlos being released from the hospital until after the shooting. But after, according to police, Britney's ATM card had been used at a convenience store. It wasn't Britney using her card. It was Carlos, allegedly using the ATM and filling up the gas tank of Britney's car. After filling up the tank, it seems like Carlos just drove and drove and drove more down south to the southern border. But right before he crossed, police got to him first. Carlos was arrested in Brownsville, Texas by the Department of Homeland Security and U.S. Customs and Border Protection. And he wasn't gone very long. He was arrested just days after Britney's murder. And he was charged with first-degree murder at that. So this was back in 2023. Nearly 2 years after Britney's murder, Carlos is now on trial. But he didn't go the typical trial route. He's doing a bench trial, meaning no jury, just a judge to decide the outcome. But if the judge decides he's guilty, he's facing up to life in prison. I'm joined now by criminal defense attorney Anthony Osso. Anthony, thank you so much for joining me today. What's your reaction to Carlos Anderson-Honeycutt going for a bench trial instead of a jury trial?
Elizabeth, I think it's odd. Unless you are going to plead directly to a judge in an effort to sort of get some compassion, I don't see why you wouldn't take your chance at trying the case on its merits to a jury before going into sentencing. So I think it's odd, and I'm interested to see kind of what the defense has up their sleeve with that decision in this case.
Do you think the defense kind of wanted a bench trial over a jury trial, mainly because of what we know from the case? You know, a gunshot wound to the head of his ex-girlfriend. They had broken up just about a week before the shooting had happened. Carlos reportedly went under a mental health evaluation. Just all the facts of the case that we know right now. Do you think that's probably why the defense leaned towards a bench trial as opposed to getting it in front of a jury?
I think that's a possibility. If from the defense perspective, if you look at the case and you think that it's sort of a slam dunk for the prosecutors, and you know that you're trying the case for punishment as opposed to guilt innocence, then maybe they felt that it was a strategic tactic to not use up a jury's time and to present their objections and things of that nature to a judge to get to the point and then get into punishment, to kind of curry favor with the judge in an effort to get a lower sentence.
And it feels like we don't know the full extent of why Carlos was in that mental facility, and not to negate, what he's been accused of doing as well too. But given what we do know, that being that Britney broke up with him, the fact that his daughter's mother wanted to take his daughter out of the state. It seems like that all just kind of may have come to a head one way or another and may have just resulted in him being in the mental facility. But my question to you is, given that, are you surprised that the defense didn't go for an insanity defense as opposed to what we know now being that bench trial?
I'm not surprised. In order to really put forth a legitimate insanity defense, you have to establish that due to mental health, that the defendant at the time of the offense was unable to recognize the consequences of his actions, and so truly not understand what he's doing. And depending on what any mental health review looked like, getting to the level of insanity is a pretty high bar. And so if it's not there, it's not there. And I think the defense probably has recognized that, or hopefully has gone through the evaluation process to make sure that that's not a valid defense.
And do you think that, and this is still alleged at this point, but do you think that Carlos planned this murder out? Because, again, going kind of back to everything just kind of crashing down on him, again, not to excuse that at all, but do you think that he had planned this all along just to kill Britnee because she was done with the relationship? Or do you think that this was a spur of the moment thing where he had a gun, allegedly shot Britnee in the head of all places? But what are your thoughts on whether or not he planned this out?
Well, I can't say the duration of which he would have planned it out, but I think that there was some level of premeditation here. And we always, when I was a prosecutor, would always argue that premeditation can happen like that. It doesn't take a long time to coordinate a plan. But I do think that when you're looking at a relationship that's riddled with domestic violence, and here I think we're seeing elements of loss of control, that probably factored into his decision to commit the murder. And I think that does amount to premeditation. So to answer your question, yeah, I think so, based on the circumstances. But I wasn't there, so it's hard to say for certain to what degree and how long.
Exactly. And then, also Carlos being apprehended down south from Wichita, Kansas, that being in Brownsville, Texas, which is right on the U.S. southern border. Do you think that he was trying to flee to Mexico and trying to escape what he had allegedly done?
I think that the prosecutors will likely argue that in this case. And to your earlier question about an insanity defense, a lot of times what the state's attorneys are going to point to are sort of attempts to cover up, flee the scene, or get rid of evidence of the crime, right? And so in this instance, they've got potentially him fleeing to Mexico, getting arrested in Brownsville. And I think that that's a really good way to throw a wrench in any defense argument that this was insanity. I wasn't in his mind, but I think the circumstances would lead me to think that he was, in fact, trying to flee to Mexico.
Yeah, and to your point, taking Britney's car, taking her ATM card as well, too, filling up that gas tank and then taking it all the way down through Texas, which from Wichita, Kansas is a very long drive, even though they're just, a few states away from one another, but it's still a long drive. So it definitely, to your point, doesn't seem like insanity kind of going on there. As someone who has dealt with domestic violence cases, even just being on this job, you learn as far as that there's always an escalation. And in your opinion, how hard is that, especially for victims, surviving or not, just dealing with that entire process, where obviously you love somebody, but just the violence and the control being in that relationship. What is it like for victims and survivors from your experience dealing with domestic violence situations?
Sure. And to be clear, I've never personally experienced it. So all of my knowledge comes from working with victims in domestic violence and my prosecution of domestic violence cases, as well as defensive domestic violence cases. And so it's an extremely difficult process for victims. I think that you've got a lot of barriers from coming out about it. It's hard to go to authorities or go to people you love to talk about your significant other and explain what's going on, whether it's just manipulation by that person or an economic barrier. There are so many reasons that victims feel that they can't come forward about what's going on behind the scenes. And so to answer your question, it's an extremely difficult situation to be in, and it happens all too often.
All too often. And it doesn't seem like there's ever just a point where someone just jumps out and just shoots somebody. It always seems like there's little breadcrumbs kind of along the way of whether it be talking to someone in a violent manner or hitting someone. It just seems like the progression just really is there. In your opinion, is there any signs to look out for? Is there any maybe points of conversation that loved ones can have with one another, especially if they think that, they don't want something like this to happen to their loved one, that they may talk to the victim just about?
Yeah, Elizabeth. So I think the biggest indicator and the biggest red flag is anytime that physical violence enters a relationship. That's your number one indicator that something's wrong and that you should take action. And if you look at the statistics, most of the majority of relationships that result in homicide by one partner against the other um, have instances of physical violence leading up to that point. So that's a red flag. But also, sort of domestic violence, emotional violence, and manipulation can go further than that. So it's sort of things like isolating you from friends and family, isolating you economically in that you don't work and I only provide you enough to get by, to act in a certain way or form or fashion. So it's things like that, and the list goes on. So those are things to be looking out for, though.
And kind of going back to Carlos's trial, which is ongoing right now, what are just kind of the big differences in a bench trial versus a jury trial beyond the jury just not being there? In your opinion, do you think that it works better for the prosecution or the defense? What do you kind of think overall just about going the bench trial route?
It's a completely different dynamic. There's really no place for theatrics because you're arguing to a judge that sees cases like this day in and day out. Um, and so your advocacy changes a little bit. I think that from a prosecutor's perspective, uh, I think it's judge specific. So and we don't know all of the facts, we don't know all of the evidence in this case, but assuming that the evidence is pretty strong for the state, I think it's probably a better route in that you only have to convince one person beyond a reasonable doubt. And from a defense perspective, they don't get the opportunity to have 12 different minds. And potentially all they have to do is hang up one juror. And here they only have one. They only have one juror in this case. So I think it's more beneficial for the state here than it is to defense. And I still think it is an odd choice to not try it for a not guilty before going to sentencing.
Yeah, it is a very interesting choice. When I saw a bench trial, I was like, that, we don't see that very often, I should say.
No, we don't.
Yeah, exactly. And do you think, given that there is no jury in this trial, that Carlos will take the stand to kind of give his say on what happened to the judge?
Um, it's hard to say. I always lean towards not putting on um, a defendant, but in certain instances, that changes. And so there have been cases where I have put the defendant on, and it just depends entirely on how his defense team feels he will hold up on the stand, whether he's made prior statements to the police beforehand, and if he can communicate effectively under pressure. So uh, it'll be interesting to see if he does or does not.
Yeah, and just overall, him allegedly shooting Britney in the head, it doesn't seem like he can kind of explain that away, that it being an accident or that being, there was a fight or a scrabble over a gun or any type of sort that way. But just overall, knowing the way that Britney died, knowing that her mother is the one that discovered her body inside her home, what are your thoughts on just those final moments that she had had? She was so young, just turned 24 years old, but what are your thoughts overall just about those final moments that she had had being attacked by someone who claimed to have loved her previously?
Terror is the only word to describe it. I mean, I can only imagine what that was like for her, and to go out that way is so sad. So, yeah, it's a sad case, and um, I'll be interested to see how the judge handles it from the guilt innocence perspective as well as sentencing. Because in Wichita, what will happen is upon a guilty or not guilty, if there's a guilty verdict, it'll be reset and the judge will handle sentencing in this case. So interested to see what goes on.
And being charged with first-degree murder at that, it's a very hefty penalty and hefty punishment. But again, the crime itself is just horrible overall. Anthony, I want to thank you so much for your time today. I always appreciate it. Before we sign you off, though, do you think that the case will end in a guilty or not guilty verdict if you had a crystal ball?
If I had a crystal ball, I think that the case is probably going to end in a guilty, only because both parties are agreeing to go to a judge, which leads me to think that this isn't necessarily a big guilt innocence issue. And so that would be my guess, but who knows? We'll see what happens.
Yeah, because you never know sometimes in our courts what can happen. Anthony, again, thank you so much for your time and your insight into this. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Elizabeth.
Carlos Anderson-Honeycutt faces up to life in prison with the possibility of parole, and he currently remains in the Sedgwick County Jail. Reporting for Law and Crime, I'm Elizabeth Millner.